Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started, everybody. I appreciate everybody coming here, both those people who are here live and also those people who are attending online. Uh, can you hear? Kat just told me she can't hear me. Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody, for showing up, and again, to both everybody here and online. This is the Burr and Forman Commercial Litigation Group presentation. Peter Zeihan, and if you haven't heard him before, you're in for a real treat. If you have heard him before, you know what you're expecting, and we have a tailor-made presentation with, as y'all might imagine, an incredible amount of information to cover. He's going to leave plenty of time for questions, and I would tell those people who are online, we have somebody monitoring the online version of Zoom. If you have a question, all you have to do is type in your question, and we'll have someone read your question out to Peter at the end. If you have a question in the room, if you'll just raise your hand, we're going to bring the microphone to you so you can state your question, and it can be, because we're recording this and it will be uploaded to both our website and YouTube. So if you have questions, just raise your hand. We'll get a microphone to you. You ask your question, and Peter will attempt to answer it. Everybody has a copy of the book in front of them. This is Peter's last book, which you may already have it. Give it to one of your friends, your son, your daughter, something like that. His newest book actually comes out next week on Tuesday, and I have to write it down because I keep getting it wrong every time I say it. The End of the World is Just the Beginning, and it comes out on this coming Tuesday. So be on the lookout for that. And Peter, if you want to mention where you can get it, then feel free to talk about that. And if you haven't subscribed to his newsletter, it's a great newsletter. He puts it out when there's something going on that is relevant to world events. So check out that. If you park in the Birmingham Parking Authority deck across the street, feel free to get your parking ticket validated at the front desk, and they will validate that for you before you leave. And I would ask everybody, if you've got a cell phone, please turn it off or turn it down and silence it. But I really do want to thank everybody for taking time out of your schedule. This could not be a more exciting, or maybe it's not exciting, it's not the right word, a more eventful time in our lives with all going on in the world, and especially the things that are going to be caused by supply chain disruption, which is one of the topics that Peter's going to cover. What's the impact of the war going to be on those type of things, and food supplies and things like that. So please sit back and enjoy. Peter, the floor's yours.
We'll just switch over to this for the time being. Test, test. There we go. Should I just take this off? Oh, well. Well, here. Can you hear me? Good. All right, let's stick with this now. Okay. After 2 years of speaking to a computer screen, I was really excited when Americans in the second, I can't outsmart this table now. When Americans in the second week of January decided that COVID was over, they don't care what the data is. I was just glad to get out of the house. And then the war happened. Now the book's dropping. So I haven't really slept in about 7 weeks. I hopefully will tonight. We'll see how that goes. Okay. Anyway, this is in one picture of my life. First, the flags. The world before the Second World War was different. It was imperial. You didn't trust your supply chains to anyone else. Got to switch? Okay. All right, here we go. The world was different. You didn't trust your supply chains to anyone else because they were all rivals. And even if everybody got along on one day, someone else could have a war and your system would be broken. After World War II, the Americans said, we're going to try something different. We will use our Navy to patrol the global ocean so that anyone can go anywhere at any time and interact with any partner and buy any commodity and sell into any market at any time. If in exchange, you will all line up shoulder to shoulder, not behind us or with us, but in front of us to absorb any ammo that might come in from Moscow. We bribed up an alliance to fight the Cold War, and it worked, but the Cold War ended in 1992. And in the next 8 presidential elections, we went with the guy who wanted to do away with the global system. That is not an aberration. That is a trend. Second, these graphics here. This is a demographic profile, so children at the bottom, mature adults and retirees at the top. Mortality tends to make it into a pyramid. And what we have here with Canada in 1965 is what most of the world looked like before 1970, because most of the world was agricultural, and kids on farms are free labor. So you have a lot of them. But with globalization, patterns changed. Suddenly, everyone could access the capital and the resources that were necessary to industrialize and urbanize. And people moved off the farm and into the cities to take those new industrial jobs. And after 70 years, you get a demographic like this. Because children on the farm are free labor, but in the city, they are very expensive, very mobile, very annoying pieces of furniture. And adults are not stupid, so they had fewer of them. These are two different economic models. In this sort of system, the population is young. It's consumption driven because you're raising cars and you're raising kids and buying cars and buying homes and going to college. But over here, the kids have moved out. The house has been paid down. You're saving for your retirement. These folks are ravenous for product. These folks build product, but they don't have a lot of people to purchase it. So low tax base, high tax base, consumption driven, investment driven. Looks to the world, kind of closes up the drawbridge. The whole world has made this transition at different times, starting from different places, moving at different speeds, but everyone has gone from the left to the right. And that means that the economic model of globalization that we're used to is already gone, and it can't be repaired, even if the Americans suddenly decide they want to hold up the ceiling for another 70 years, which I would argue that we don't. And with that in your back pocket, let's talk about the war. What we have here is a population density map. If you're in that lighter orange, this is the Russian space and it's on its side. So if you have to do that, go ahead. North to your right. The lighter orange that goes from roughly Eastern Europe into Western Siberia, that V of orange, that's where almost everyone in the Russian space lives. And that lighter color of orange is roughly the same population density as the eastern half of Nebraska if you rub out Lincoln and Omaha. So you do have neighbors. You probably won't see them every week. Over here, we have a combination climate and economic map. Now, the green roughly overlaps with this orange. And this green is the Russian wheat belt. It's the part of the Russian territories where the weather is not completely awful all the time. You go outside on October 1st, you won't freeze your nose off. You wait till November, you're totally screwed. But that's the part that's economically viable. But if you go to the right, to the north, to the blue, you are then in territory that is tundra and taigai, and no one lives there. If you go to the left, to the south, to the yellow, you're moving into desert. No one lives there. So we are left with a relatively small part of the overall Russian territory that's worth anything. But it is surrounded by these shoulder lands in gray that aren't really useful, but they're still flat and open. And the Russians get really depressed when they look at this graphic because they realize anyone who makes it into that gray is then fast and loose in the Russian territories, and they can fight a war of movement because they had to fight a war of movement just to get there. Whereas the Russians have slight population density because the farmland sucks and the climate sucks. And it's very difficult to fight any sort of defense. So Russian strategies going back to before Catherine the Great have been simple. Expand beyond the green to a series of geopolitical barriers, the deserts, the seas, the mountains, and then forward position your troops in static defenses in these gateway territories. If they can do that, they reduce the distance that they have to defend by about 90%, and that they can pull off. Now, during Soviet times, they controlled all of those gateways. When the Soviet system collapsed, they dropped down to one. Everything that Putin has done since then in terms of foreign affairs and security policy has been about getting Russian troops on the ground in those gateways. And he succeeded in 4 of them. This is what the Georgian War was about. This is the Crimea War. This is the Kazakh intervention. So it's not so much that the Russians won't stop until they've gotten all of Ukraine. It's that they will not stop when they get all of Ukraine, because Ukraine is not one of the gateways. It's simply on the path to them. And it's the Bessarabian Gap in Romania and the Polish Gap that they're ultimately after here. And Putin showed his hand yesterday. He gave a speech in which he said that the Great Northern War of 1700 to 1721, that was not about Russia seizing territory from Sweden. It was about Russia reclaiming territory from Sweden. Now, that's a very creative look at Russian history, if you ask me. But the territory in question is modern-day Estonia and Latvia. We've always known that this war was going to happen. The only question was when. And Putin very clearly is getting ready for this to be the last big push for all of it. Where are my Texans? It's not as big as they tell you. Russia's borders are 3 times the length of ours, and they're trying to defend them with half the population. That makes them aggressive. That makes them desperate. And it ultimately makes it a temporary threat, because this is the Russian demography. It should be a pyramid. But because of a number of collapses throughout their system, World War I, World War II, the Holodomor, the famines, and ultimately the post-Soviet collapse, there's giant chunks that have been ripped out. And this is the biggest chunk of them all. This is the people, the children who were born in the 1990s. When the Soviet system collapsed, the birth rate halved, the death rate doubled, and they never recovered. These are the people who are being drafted right now. It's their last generation. Now, it looks like they've got another group down here that pops out. But 8 years ago, the Russians just found 8 million children and threw into the data one day with no explanation, and they haven't updated the data since. So this gap probably just cuts straight down. This war was always going to happen, and demographics told us it had to happen now, because there isn't another Russian generation to attempt. So the Russian goal is to use their last moment to secure the perimeter so that they can then die slowly. And if they fail, they die quickly. And when they know they're going to die, all tools are on the table. So let's talk about where we are with the war now. The first big phase started up in Belarus and pushed to Kiev. You guys remember that massive convoy, the 40-mile-long vehicle train, about how one day after it started, it stalled because they forgot fuel trucks? And 2 days after that, all the troops dismounted and walked back to Belarus because they forgot food. Now, when folks in the US military that I chat with often talk about this, they describe that at first everyone was just elated because, holy crap, the Russians don't know how to fight a modern war. This is great. We can totally take them. And then they went and took a nap and had some bourbon and really thought about it. They're like, holy crap, the Russians don't know how to fight a modern war. We can totally take them. That's bad. Because we now know if there's any direct fight between the Russians and NATO, that the Russian force will be eradicated. And the Russians will have a simple choice: full withdrawal along all points of contact, at least to the pre-war borders, maybe further, or escalate to involve nukes. And since the Russians see this as an existential fight for survival, they'd probably go with option B. So our big lesson from the convoy failure was that we can't let that direct NATO-Russian fight happen at all. We have to make sure that the Russian military dies here, now, in Ukraine, this calendar year, because we only have enough weapon systems to supply Ukraine for that long. We are already 1/3 through our Javelin and our Stinger inventory. We don't have a supply chain in place to build out more Stingers. They're designing it now. And the existing supply chain system for Javelins, it would take us 2.5 years to replace what we've already given them. And we have more than everyone else in NATO. So we're going to get to this winter, and if the Ukrainians haven't destroyed the Russian army, they lose. They've put up a great fight, but they can't do it without equipment, and the Russians are now dusting off their tank reserve, which is another 10,000 tanks. And in a fight between a badly maintained, decades-old tank division on the Russian side and an unarmed Ukrainian infantry force, I mean, there's no contest there. The Russians took lessons from this too. They now know they're not going to be welcomed in anywhere ever again. And so they've dusted off a strategy that predates World War I. Approach an area with artillery, fire at anything that looks like civilian infrastructure, destroy everything, and then sweep the area and kill whoever's left. Because the population in that sort of civilian obliteration strategy will self-separate. Most will become refugees and you never have to worry about them again. And for the ones who stay, clearly they're fighters. So the Russians have withdrawn the Wagner group, that's their mercenaries, from most of their operations around the world, and they've activated their Chechen loyalists to basically sweep the population, so there's one step removed in terms of moral separation. We know now from German radio intercepts that the war crimes in Bucha, north of Kiev, are not atypical, that it's happened at least 70 different locations. And some of these places have now been occupied by the Russians for 100 days. We also know that the Russians are relocating children by at least the hundreds of thousands to make sure that there is no next generation of Ukraine. That's the first big thing. Second big thing, starting from occupied Crimea and the puppet republics and merging on the city of Mariupol right here. Now, Mariupol is, of course, important because it is a land bridge between Russia proper and the population of Crimea, which is about 2 million people. And while the Russians did occupy this in the last war, they are, for the most part, ethnic Russians that are in Crimea. The problem is not so much the road link, it's the rail link. This is the Kerch Strait Bridge, which the Russians finished after occupying Crimea in the last war. It is the only rail connection between Russia proper and most of the territories that they are fighting in. If that bridge is taken out, and with some of the new missiles that NATO is providing the Ukrainians, it's probably not long for this world. That is their only source of material for the military, and it is the only source of food for the population. For Ukraine to win, they need to retake Mariupol and blow up that bridge. And if they do that, we will get kind of this magical threshold of 500,000 Russian deaths, which is generally considered in Russian history to be the minimum for the Russians to consider a change in strategy. They have never lost less than that in any war in their history. Sorry, I said that wrong. That's the minimum threshold for them to lose the war in their mind. Anything less than that is something they can just shoulder through. So the number of people that the Ukrainians have killed on the battlefield so far, they now need to do that at least another 12 times before they run out of weapons. That's the scale of the challenge here. There's a challenge in progress up here. The Russians are trying to connect these two little nubs, specifically at the city of Severodonetsk. That's probably the place you've been seeing in the media the last couple of weeks. If the Russians can do this successfully, they trap the majority of the most skilled Ukrainian troops in a pocket, and then they can destroy them at their leisure. 3 weeks ago, the Ukrainians seemed to have the upper hand. 2 weeks ago, the Russians seemed to have the upper hand. Right now, it's just going back and forth, back and forth. And then finally, starting from Crimea, a push towards the city of Odessa. Odessa is their manufacturing hub, their financial hub, and it sits at the mouth of the Dniester River, making it the primary export point. It is New York and Chicago and St. Louis and Houston and New Orleans all in one. And if the Russians successfully capture it, that is the end of Ukraine as an economic entity. Most likely outcome is that the Ukrainians lose the war this year. And then it turns into a partisan conflict with a lot of countries, the US included, supplying the guerrilla forces. That is our most likely outcome here. And if that guerrilla force is kept alive long enough, it will bleed the Russians and hit that horrible 500,000 number. But it also means that if it fails, we get to do this all over again with NATO countries. And since we know that the Russian conventional forces are not up to it, nukes will be used or threatened to be used on the first day. Let's talk about the impact on the economics of everything. Now, the red lines are natural gas pipelines and the green lines are oil pipelines. First up, this spot, Novorossiysk. It is the single largest oil loading facility they have. It's right on the Black Sea, can handle almost 2 million barrels a day. The problem that the Russians are having is that anything that loads up at Novorossiysk is technically in a war zone, and it's very hard for them to get insurance for their ships. So based on the day, it's been operating at 20 to 80% capacity. Up further north, you've got Primorsk on the Baltic. Similar story, but it's not in the war zone. Now, last week, the Europeans barred all European entities from providing any insurance cover to any ship that goes to any Russian port. The Europeans are responsible for 95% of all global maritime insurance. And if a ship cannot get insurance, it won't sail. Because if something goes wrong, the owner is fully responsible for it. And considering cargo and the expense of ships, that's like $1 billion question for most ship captains. We don't know if this is going to work yet. We're going to find out real soon. Because if anyone wants to get crude from either of these ports, they now have to offer a sovereign indemnification. That is a step that probably the Indians are not willing to take. And the Indians are the ones who are buying the most Russian crude these days. And honestly, if they tried it, it could get really fun really fast. Because the United States is the most powerful navy in the world by a large margin. The second most powerful is Britain. The fourth most powerful is France, all in NATO. So if somebody does try it, I would love it to see a NATO country seize the ship, because it would mean that the country offering the indemnification would have to suck up the entirety of the insurance lost. And in addition to being embarrassing and a big financial hit, it would crash their local markets because they wouldn't be able to insure anything anymore. So like I said, it could be a lot of fun. These pipelines, they go through either Belarus proper or nearby in Ukraine. This is where the bulk of the stuff that goes to Europe flows. One of two things is going to happen. Number one, the Russians with their artillery assaults are going to blow up some of the pipes accidentally. And before you say, no, they wouldn't do that, remember they blew up the sarcophagus around Chernobyl on the third day of the war. Or when the Ukrainians feel that they really are losing, they sabotage their own infrastructure to make sure the Russians can't profit from the occupation. Either way, those lines are going down. Now, what this tells me is that one way or another, we've got threats to the vast majority of Russian oil and natural gas output. Now, this isn't Alabama. This is not the Texas Permian. You can't shut in these wells and just come back a year or two later and turn them on, because most of the wells in Russia are in Siberia. They're in permafrost. So you've got a frozen subsoil layer at all times. As long as the crude is flowing, it doesn't get cold enough to freeze. But if it does stop flowing for any reason, the oil turns to gel in the pipes. The water that comes up as a byproduct freezes, and when water freezes, it expands. And it will trigger microfractures in the entire system all the way from the export point to the wellhead, and the wellbore. And that means you can never use those wells again. You have to re-drill them. The last time this happened, it was 1992. It took the Russians 30 years to get everything running again, with a lot of help from foreign service companies who are no longer in Russia. So we are looking later this year at somewhere between 5 and 6 million barrels a day of Russian and Kazakh crude falling off the market and never coming back. We have not priced that in. And then there's these guys. These are natural gas pipelines that go under the Baltic direct to Germany and under the Black direct to Turkey. They're immune to those problems that I identified because they don't have to get maritime insurance, and they don't have to worry about an end to import points, and they're natural gas, so they don't even have to worry about freezing. We're going to be at a situation very soon where the Russians can go to the Germans and the Turks and directly and honestly say, look, we can keep the power on for you, but only for you. It has a cost, not to be paid in rubles, but to be paid in NATO. You want to keep your energy on? Fine. You are no longer part of the Ukraine coalition. And there is no logistical position for the United States in this war without those two countries. A lot of countries are going to have to make a lot of very serious questions later this year. Okay, let's talk about products. If you consider Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine a single entity for economic purposes, which in this war I think is a wise idea, everything in that first column is something where the Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians collectively are the world's largest supplier, second largest for the second column, and so on. We've already talked about the energy question quite a bit, so let's move on to green tech. If you want to move on beyond petroleum, that sounds great, right? Cuts out the Russians, right? Well, not really. We can't have globally available, affordable fossil fuels without the Russians. But we also can't build the things we need for the green transition without them. They're actually more important to supply chains. And if anything, it's worse than it sounds, because the components that are necessary to go into green tech are far more involved than they are for traditional internal combustion engines. So here you can just see what goes in on the front end in terms of the amount of power, kilograms per vehicle. Conventional cars are quite easy. The problem there, of course, is fueling them. But if you want to do EVs at scale, you need a significantly wider supply chain system. And the same holds true for where you get the electricity from in the first place. Conventional's cheap. Green tech is not. And of course, there's the supply chain itself. We understand that moving oil around the world's a pain, because we have to deal with Venezuela and Iran and Iraq and Russia, and we're eager to move on from that. But if you want to do green tech at scale, you need Mexico and Canada and Peru and Argentina and Bolivia and Brazil and Australia and Cambodia and Pakistan and India and China and, oh yeah, still Russia. This doesn't work without the Russians with today's technology. And it's all going away. Moving on, iron's a fun one, steel. Okay, most countries treat steel as a national security issue. So they might import the iron ore, but they'll throw it through the blast furnace to get an intermediate product called pig iron or semi-finished iron. And then they will process that further to get finished steel. We don't do that. We are the world's best steel recyclers. On average, the steel that is in this building has probably already been used 4 or 5 times. And it's fine. It's just as strong as the original. It's not as pretty. Recycled steel doesn't give you that bright metallic sheen. Think of like taking a piece of aluminum foil and crumpling it up and then trying to reuse it. You iron it out to get the rinks out. You're never going to get it right. But it's just as strong. Here in the United States, the only time we use, or actually forge steel, is for the pretty stuff. And we do produce the highest end steel in the world, but we don't have steel foundries. So that first blast furnace step, we don't do that. We import someone else's semi-finished iron. 2/3 of what we use comes from Russia and Ukraine. The only other country that produces at scale is Brazil. Now it gets depressing. Russia is the world's largest wheat exporter, and they have invaded the world's 4th largest wheat exporter. And they are in the midst of a civilian infrastructure obliteration program that is singling out agricultural facilities, cold storage, terminals, tractors. They have multiple reasons to go after tractors. And then it gets really bad. Russia was the world's largest exporter of most fertilizer types before the war. Russia plus Belarus are responsible for 40% of the global market for potash, one of the 3 fertilizer types. Most of this is exported via the Black Sea port of Novorossiysk. We already had a global fertilizer shortage before February 22nd, when the war began. Now we are looking at prices up already between 50 and 200%. We have already been forced to do significant crop switching in the United States. And most of the developing world has had to get by on less than half of the fertilizer that we would normally use. We do not know yet what the impact is going to be on yields. It is probably going to be very, very bad, but we won't really know until we get closer to harvest. So look to the first couple of weeks of September for a lot of very, very, very dark news. In the meantime, the Chinese are dying for reasons all their own. There are a number of reasons that we'll dive into during this presentation, but one of the most important ones is right here. Chairman Xi Jinping is driving the country into the ground, and this may be the last year of the People's Republic. Now, the Chinese system has always encouraged strongmen, but Xi has created a cult of personality far more powerful and all-inclusive than any Chinese leader in history, and that includes Mao Zedong himself. He has intimidated or driven out or exiled or imprisoned or everyone in the country who is capable of independent thought. And it is now a one-man show. And think of the bigger companies in the world. Can you imagine what would happen if the CEO was the only decision maker? Because that's what we have in China now. It's great for an ego trip. It's horrible for management. And so we are getting decisions coming down from the top that are completely uninformed by facts on the ground because no one wants to bring the chairman news. Not news he might get mad about, news at all. Now, we like to make fun of Biden being older than dust. And last Thanksgiving, when Biden had his 4-hour conversation with Xi, we made fun of Biden for seeming out of touch and asking the wrong questions and not being as tough. And, you know, that's all legitimate. But did you see what happened on the other side of the table? Xi was asking him really basic questions about the United States, about the world, about China, because he hasn't been briefed. He has met with one world leader since December of 1999. One. You can go and you can read the transcript on the You can go and read the transcript on the White House website. It's just whitehouse.gov. Do not let it autofill. Whitehouse.com is not somewhere you want to go. That is a porn site. You do not want that in your browser history. Amazon will just go nuts with the things they're going to recommend for you, okay? So Gov. But it's all there. Now, of course, the issue of the moment is COVID. Now, I think there are probably a diversity of opinions here and online about whether or not getting natural immunity from suffering through COVID and recovering is better or worse than taking the vaccine. I'm sure we all have our opinions, but I think if we're all being honest, we will admit that there is something to the other side's points of view. Well, in China, they haven't had the option of either. The Chinese have been successful broadly in keeping COVID from circulating within the population. So very, very few people have any natural immunity. More importantly, from my point of view, the Chinese COVID vaccine doesn't work at all against Omicron. It was 55% effective at preventing severe disease and death versus the original wild strain out of Wuhan. But since then, we've had Alpha and Beta and Delta and Omicron A, Omicron B, Omicron Fuchsia ThreatCon 7, or wherever we are now, and it doesn't work at all. So lockdowns are the only health policy option that the Chinese system has. And we see their lockdowns to a degree as a sign of weakness. But in Xi's head, because no one dares tell him anything, he sees it as a wild success. He might actually believe the propaganda that China is the model to follow internationally for dealing with COVID. And even if he doesn't have a lot of choice. So Shanghai shut down on April 1. They were shut down for 2 months. They reopened last week. They're already shutting down again. Because Omicron B is the most prolific communicable virus humans have ever dealt with. And it is the most lethal of the COVID variants to date. We don't feel that here because we have had a degree of antibodies from one, the other, or both. No one in China has that. So if China were to open up, you would be looking literally at a few million deaths a month for at least 6 months. And in a one-man rule, that wouldn't work. So they know they can't have energy security. They know they can't have physical security. They know they've been kind of lumped up with the Russians as a state to avoid. And then health security is a reach. All that's left is food security. Now, 3 years ago, the Chinese suffered from something called African swine fever. It's basically Ebola for pigs. Nasty little virus, very communicable, not as communicable as COVID, but it's lethal and it spreads fast. And the Chinese had to cull 2/3 of their herd. In a year and a half, they killed more of their own hogs for health reasons than the rest of the world has hogs. And they've been rebuilding it ever since. The problem is they forgot to abrogate the debt for the failed hog farmers. So they're all out of the market. They offered subsidies to bring in new folks. 2 million people who had never stepped foot on a farm are now hog farmers, taking advantage of the subsidy structures. And let's just say that the word phytosanitary does not translate into Mandarin very well. So according to Chinese statistics, there's not a single case of African swine fever anywhere in the country. Just like in Shanghai, they say officially only 2 people died, whatever, from COVID. But every country around them on their borders has raging cases. So it's only a matter of time before they go through a second mass culling. What's the only other culturally significant food product that China has? Rice. Rice is the most phosphate fertilizer hungry crop on the planet. The Chinese used to be the world's largest exporter of it. They've stopped all exports for the time being, and they probably will not restart in the next 2 years. So because of what's going on in Ukraine, we've lost potash. Because of what's going on in China, we've lost phosphate. We'll come back to that too. This is the USS Fort. This is the newest American supercarrier. It is the single most powerful weapon of war humanity has ever built. All by itself, it can challenge any of the world's air forces up to the 7 most powerful by itself. And that's assuming a fair fight. Carriers, by definition, don't fight fair because they move. So the carrier gets to choose the time and the place of the engagement. That means there's only 3 air forces on the planet that are more powerful than a single Ford. That includes the United States as one of those 3. We're going to build 4 of these bad boys. In addition to the 10 existing Nimitz carriers, which until this guy came along were the world's most powerful. If you want to knock off a country, this is the right tool for the job. If you want to patrol the global ocean so that global commerce can be smooth and safe and cheap, this is a horrible system because you can only be in one place at a time. You need these instead, destroyers. You need hundreds of them, probably at least 800. We have 70. Half of them are dedicated to being part of the protective shell around the carriers. At current rates of build out, we will not be able to hit that magical number to patrol the global oceans this century or next. There is not a military on the planet that can protect global commerce anymore. We've retooled since the Cold War. It's all carriers or nothing. Now, I'm sure you guys have heard that the Chinese have a big fleet. We only have about 290 ships right now. They have over 600, but most of them would fit in this room. Not all at the same time, one at a time, but they're small. Only 10% of the Chinese vessels can sail more than 1,000 miles from shore. In fact, that 1,000-mile number is a little false because it assumes they're not getting shot at, so they can go in a straight line, slow to conserve fuel. Under battle conditions, they probably can't make it more than 400 miles from shore. No one can protect global commerce. No one. And for the Chinese, this gets really bad really quick. This is just a simple population density map. This little circle's half the world's population, 3/4 of the world's manufacturing supply chain steps, half of its energy and agricultural shipments. It is the part of the world that is most economically dense because of the Asian rise, and the Chinese are completely incapable of dominating the space. In any reasonable war scenario that the Chinese are involved in, someone that they don't like, Japan, Vietnam, us, India, Australia now, is going to put 2 destroyers in the Indian Ocean basin and cut the energy cord. The Chinese import 85% of their energy. 85% of that comes from the Persian Gulf, a place that they can't reach. China is absolutely doomed from an energy point of view, in addition to being doomed from a leadership point of view. Let's talk energy. This is total investment from all oil and all natural gas, from all government and all private sources, to all fields everywhere in the world. This is all the money that gets thrown at that sector. Now, in 2014, at the peak, a story started circulating in the world's financial capitals, whether in Japan or Tokyo or Paris, that fossil fuels were done. It takes 3 to 8 years to bring a fossil fuel field online, and another decade to break even. So why would you put your hard-earned money into an energy fund when you are never going to get it back? Because we're going to be done with fossil fuels by 2030, right? That's what we're hearing. Well, okay. There's a lot of with that line of thinking that I think is patently false, but it took hold, and people started divesting. And in the next 9 years, total investment into the space dropped by half. It takes 3 to 8 years to bring a field online. So assuming nothing goes wrong, today's prices are with us until at least 2025. And a whole lot of things are going wrong. I mean, this assumes no problem in Ukraine, for example. Now, what is true for the whole is not necessarily true for all the parts. This is one of my favorite graphic sequences. This is from the first book. This is the world at night. This is what I like to call the checkbook map, because every dot is someone who has paid their power bill. And this is where the conventional oil and gas fields are. And you'll notice that they're inconveniently far from where we actually live. Most of the angst of the Cold War and post-Cold War era from a security and energy point of view has been about getting the energy to where it's actually consumed. I'm going to click one more time here and show you where the shale is. Pay particular attention to North America and the Arabian Peninsula. There's a dozen major things about shale that are fundamentally different from conventional crude. I think this is the most important one. We produce it where we live, but only in the United States. So the United States used to need global energy to keep everything running. And that was a good reason for us to be involved in global structures. That time has passed. We now get over 75% of our energy right here at home. And the remaining 20% is kind of a swap deal. The thicker the line, the more crude oil is going along it in tankers. This one is by far the most important. Very, very, very easy to kill China. Sri Lanka could do it. The Chinese know this. I don't expect them to attempt a breakout. But in case you're worried about Taiwan, keep in mind that absolutely everything they thought would break their way in a war has now been proven to be the opposite. The Russians have always served as kind of the canary in the coal mine for the Chinese. Not that the Chinese are going to parrot what they do, but that the Chinese will learn from what the Russians do. So step one, the idea that the war would be quick and easy. Well, that's proven wrong. Ukraine's only been preparing for this conflict for 8 years. Taiwan has been preparing for their confrontation for 70. Second, the idea that we're such a large economy, of course the world would just suck it up and take it as a done deal and move on. Well, that hasn't happened. And if you take the sanctions that go against Russia right now and you put them on China, say what you will about the Russians. They've got a lot wrong, but they are a major exporter of food and energy, whereas the Chinese are a major importer. So the sanctions on Russia are hurting their bank account. Absolutely. You put those same sanctions on China, you have a complete deindustrialization collapse in under a year. But I think what's really spooked the Chinese the most isn't the sanctions, but the boycotts. The idea that individual private citizens have any say in policy, that is so alien to them, they can't even wrap their heads around it. Or at least they couldn't wrap around their heads around it if Xi hadn't shot them all. We're now in a position where every assumption they've made for the last 45 years on how a war with Taiwan would go has been proven wrong in just a few weeks. Now, this is normally the point where Xi would take all of his smart folks and put them in the back room with some beer and pizza and say, come out with another proposal. I need a plan B. But he's literally killed all of those people. So China is slamming its head into the wall over and over and over and over and over until something cracks. There's more to shale than oil. There's also natural gas. This is the natural gas prices at Henry Hub, our primary pricing junction for that product. For those of you who live close to the Gulf Coast, you of course will know what these are. These are hurricanes. When you get half of your natural gas production from the offshore shelf and a hurricane comes in, you have to evacuate the rigs, shut them down, come back the next day after the storm passes and try to make sense of all the damage and untangle the pipes on the seafloor. During that time, your natural gas is not on, and you get price spikes that can last for months. But by 2009, things had changed, because now over half of our natural gas as of 2009 was produced from shale fields, and all shale fields are onshore. And so we had a nice 12-year period of everything being very, very quiet. No Texans, right? This was what happened last January when Texas got cold. Everything collapsed in their energy system, including their natural gas production. So natural gas prices tripled, but still came nowhere near the 50-year average. And this right here is what we're bitching about now. This is our high energy prices. We're at 41% of the century average. You guys want to see what the Europeans and the Chinese are bitching about? Europe is probably already in recession. There's no way they can't be if this can last for them otherwise. Europe. And the Europeans have stopped producing nitrogen-type fertilizers because it's made from natural gas. In fact, we're seeing shutdowns in China as well because of it. US, we're building out as fast as we can, but it takes a minimum of 3 years to build a new natural gas processing facility to make and use fertilizer. If you take the top 5 producers globally of all of these commodities, at least 2 of the 5 are going to have to stop producing them this or next year because they don't have enough nitrogen fertilizer. We haven't had anything like this happen in human history, and it's all happening at the same time. I hate this graphic. This is my least favorite graphic, but it's probably the most important. The deep blue and the deep green are the major exporters of grain and soy-based calories in the world. Everyone else is a net importer. And countries in orange and red import at least half of the calories they consume. You break down the fertilizer supply system, these are the countries looking at least a 40% reduction in their ability to grow the crop in the first place. We get a multi-continental famine, multi-years long, that begins in the 4th quarter of this year. Now, in the United States, we look at this and we're like, ooh, ah, oh. You double the price of wheat in the US, and it pushes up the cost of a loaf of bread by 25 cents. It's not a deal killer for us. We are the world's largest agricultural producer. We have the most secure agricultural input stream system. We'll be all right. But half of the world food program's wheat comes from Ukraine. So you know the poorest of the poor are going to get hosed. We know that what is going to happen to the Middle East and North Africa already, because it's already happened once. The last time there were interruptions out of the former Soviet world, prices doubled for wheat globally. They tripled in prices in the primary market, North Africa. We got the Arab Spring and the Syrian Civil War. This is going to be at least 3 times as bad. We also know that Brazil, even though it is an agricultural powerhouse, imports over 85% of their fertilizers from the former Soviet Union. Now, they were able to front load orders in late February. They saw what was coming. They're okay with for their current crop, but they have nothing for the next one. India and Pakistan are similarly dependent. And then, of course, sub-Saharan Africa is not in a great spot. Now, sub-Saharan Africa is in fourth on that list of problems because they haven't fully industrialized. They don't use as much fertilizer per output as we do. In addition, you have a lot more people in agriculture, so it's a little bit more like gardening than farming. And that's not a negative, especially not now, because if you give each individual plant attention, you get high yields. So Middle East, Brazil, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa. Those are the 4 regions to watch. September is when we will have our first good idea of just how bad this is going to be. All right, let's talk finance. This is net worth by decade of life as an adult. You max out your net worth in the final decade before you retire because the kids have gone on, your house is paid down, and you are preparing for retirement. All your money can go to your savings. Now, normally, this distinction would not matter because normally you would have a demographic structure like Nigeria. And so whoever you have in that 60-something that's about to retire, you're gonna have more in their 50s and more in their 40s and so on. It's the same proportion, has been throughout human history until the global order encouraged industrialization and urbanization at different rates. So every country now has their own demographic profile with imbalances and inequalities among the generations. You all remember the baby boomers, right? They are our largest generation born ever, and they are nearing retirement. In fact, on average, they retire at the end of the year, which means all of their savings are about to be converted. Because the day you retire, you cash in your stocks and your bonds, and you go to you cash in your stocks and your bonds, and you go into greenbacks and T-bills. Because if there's a currency crash or a market crash, you will never recover. You no longer have new income to take advantage of or recover from some shocks. So you go from having the largest, most liquid, highest velocity investments of your life to a glacier overnight. And for the baby boomers, on average, that happens at the end of the year. The next generation down is my generation, Gen X, and there are not enough of us. So we know we're facing a capital crash, global in scope, next year. It's just damn inconvenient that it's happening at the same time that the business cycle is turning as well. Probably means that people will blame the business cycle rather than demographic underpinnings. We also have a labor problem. Boomers were the largest generation ever. That means they're also the largest part of the workforce. And something interesting happened to the boomers. When they all entered the workforce in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s, there were so many of them, they pushed down the cost of labor. They competed themselves out of jobs. Got so bad that a lot of boomer families decided that the second spouse had to enter the workforce as well, which only made it worse. That's one of the reasons, the financial pressure of that, why the baby boomers have the highest divorce rate in history. Now, my generation looks at that like, there's so many things about the baby boomers that are just stupid, and we're certainly not following in their footsteps for that one. For us, our time is at least as important as our money. So whereas the boomers have the highest labor participation rate ever, we have the lowest, and we're proud of it. Now, for the last 20 years, that has absolutely worked against us because you've got like 4 Xers for 15 billion boomers, and we got lost in the noise. We were the low men on the totem pole. We were interns for longer than any generation before, and we had the lowest raises for any generation up till now. But now that the baby boomers are leaving, it's our time. Because all of these top-level jobs across the entire system are becoming available at the same time. And even if we all wanted to work, and we do not, there would not be enough of us to fill all the spots. So we are now enjoying the highest raises in human history, or American history, and we have at least another 12 years to go with that. We call this labor inflation, folks. It's not Biden, it's not Trump, it's just our population structure. It's the single biggest reason why we're facing high inflation right now. There are others, of course. I don't mean to suggest that the presidents are scot-free on this one, But the monetary policy, the debt spending, that's like number 7 on the list as far as I'm concerned. This is number 1. Number 1B are the Zoomers. They're the smallest generation we've ever had. And they are, what's the best way to phrase this? They're not millennials. Millennials, we know. They're collaborative, they're cooperative, they're social, they're good at management. All these things are true. Positive stereotypes backed up by data. That is not the Zoomers. The Zoomers, well, the millennials were raised by the baby boomers to be told they're special. That's part of the reason why they're so affable most of the time. The Zoomers were raised by my generation. So we told them growing up that you will never have Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid. You are on your own. You will always be outnumbered. You will never have a president because the millennials, like the boomers, will always outvote you. You have to be better than everyone all the time if you want to get by. You can't rely on anyone. That has made them the most antisocial generation ever, the most medicated generation ever. And their dream job is to be locked in a closet in the dark coding. They are incredibly loyal workers. If you give them a job, they will try to stay with you for their entire lives. But they never want to meet you. I mean, people talk about mental health and COVID and being locked up. This has been the best 2 years in the Zoomers' lives. And they're the smallest generation we've ever had. So we've got the baby boomers at the top that are leaving, the largest generation we've ever had. We're replacing them with the smallest one ever. This year, we have a shortage of 400,000 workers just because of that swap. That number will increase every year until at least 2034, where it will probably top out at about 900,000 shortage a year. That's the scale of this phase of our labor shortages. There's another one, because then we've got the millennials. Now, we've all heard the positive ones. Let's talk about the negative, because they're true too, totally backed up by data. Narcissistic, obsessive, lazy, entitled, first job at 27, mom still drives them to work. Backed up by data, all true for half of them. For the other half, it's a radically different story. The other half have always done everything we expected. That's the wrong word. The other half have always done everything we demanded of them. They graduated from school in 3.5 years. They didn't go to Europe for a couple of years to find themselves. They went straight into the workforce. And because of it, they were absolutely screwed, because they were the last ones in when the financial crisis happened. So they were the first ones kicked out. So whether it's because the millennials did everything right or wrong, they lost out on 3 to 5 years of formative work experience in their 20s. They will never get that back. They will always be behind until they retire. They're the least skilled generation we have ever had for their age bracket. The hope for the labor market is not with the millennials. It's with the millennials' kids. The millennials, like the boomers, are a large generation, and a large generation generates a large generation. So we just have to wait for the millennials' children to grow up to enter the workforce. On average, that will not happen until 2045. We have labor inflation until then. So if you want to hire, don't wait 3 months or 9 months or 90 months. Do it now. It won't get better for a long time. Back to finance. The United States is the only country with the United States is the only country with a millennial generation, which means the United States is really the only country with a consumption base right now. The United States is the only country with a consumption base right now. What was the sentence before that? We're the only ones with a millennial generation. The one thing that makes American baby boomers unique, the one thing, there's only one, they had kids. The world's other boomers didn't. So do we give the millennials a lot of crap? Yeah. Do they deserve it? Oh yeah. But they exist. They actually are special. Ugh. These are the 4 largest economies in the world. Japan hit population of no return, age of no return, definite demographic death in the 90s. Europe hit it in the 2000s. China's a special case. Now, if you ignore these yellow bars and just assume they're red, that was the demographic structure that the Chinese presented in January of 2000. At that point, they were already the fastest aging labor force in the world. One-child policy. 40 years later, you have a problem. It's 40 years later. Anyone tells you that the Chinese are good at math, they are lying. Now, what has happened since January of 2000 is that the Chinese have completed their 10-year census. Because of COVID, it took them a little bit longer to collate everything, so it hasn't been fully released yet, but they have been letting bits and pieces of it out. And they're now grudgingly, publicly admitting that they overcounted their population by in excess of 100 million people, all of whom would have been born since one child, so people aged 40 and under, and most of whom would have been women because selective sex abortions within China are very popular. If that's true, those yellow bars don't exist. Remember, they were the fastest aging before. This means that the Chinese economic model is already dead. This means that the Chinese population peaked back in the mid-2000s. And this means that China will have less than half its population that it has currently by 2050. China will die this decade. Demographics will guarantee it. They just don't have enough people to even theoretically rebuild their population at this point. What's going with Russia, with Ukraine, with energy, and with Xi can speed that up. But if you are dependent upon parts from China, what are you waiting for? It's like Shanghai was shut down for 2 months. I mean, what more signals do you need that they're no longer a reliable producer and participant in international supply chains? And that's before it gets really scary. Now, in the United States, we have an option that most other countries don't. We have Mexicans. They have been our partners in the labor force in the production cycle for 40 years. They have one of the healthiest demographies in the world, by far the healthiest in the advanced developing world. This is great. Now, it's not perfect. Whoops, sorry, didn't mean to hit that. As you can see, it kind of goes straight down from here. The tequila crisis hit the Mexicans in 1995, kind of a combination of our S&L crisis and our subprime crisis in one. They had to get a US bailout to recover. And they decided they never wanted to be in that position again, so they started to diversify their economy into manufacturing, using this crazy, crazy Canadian idea called NAFTA. And they haven't had to face anything like that again. But it also means that they started moving off the farm and into the cities, and the birth rates halved. Now, this is not a terminal demography. They can coast on this a very long time. But it does mean that the peak supply of Mexican labor to the American market has already passed. And Mexican net migration to the US has now been negative for 12 of the last 13 years. It'll probably never be positive again. So we need to start thinking of Mexican labor in a way that we never have before, as a precious resource to be applied sparingly. Now, we can't go to China and do a snout count and confirm the data, but we can look at some data we trust. This is net wages in a number of Southeast Asian countries. Here are our Mexican partners, very competitive, and here's the PRC. It's the fastest labor appreciation ever in history, anywhere, under any circumstances. Faster than wartime, faster than the Black Death. And they have nowhere to go but up. So labor costs in China have increased by a factor of 16 since 1999. Labor productivity has only increased by a factor of 2 or 3. There is no longer a single manufacturing product that the Chinese can make at a lower price point than its equivalent in North America. The only reason we even discuss China as a manufacturing power any longer is because of the sunk cost of the pre-existing industrial plant. You don't move that to the US and Mexico overnight. But we have now been in the fastest industrialization process that we have ever seen for 6 years, 7 years. We have a long way to go, but we've started. Back to Mexico. Well, this is Peru, actually. This is total Peruvian exports, all the products, and this is where they go. So this is a pretty simple standard setup for most developing countries. Relatively low value products, very little processed, very little value add, mostly going to the East Asian rim where they metabolize it to make value added products. This is pretty typical for the developing world, doubly so for Latin America. These little categories right here, those are the value added products. That's what we call manufacturing. You guys want to see Mexico? Yeah. I love me some Mexico. Radically different. In terms of the value add of the products coming in versus out, this is the most highly value added economy in the world. And we are privileged to be their partners. It is also more highly skilled with a larger labor force than the entirety of Central Europe, all in one place. This is a good partner. Of course, it's not all sunshine and tacos. This is a climate map. Everything in kind of yellow is arid, like West Texas arid. Everything in orange is hard desert. Everything in green is tropical. And anything that's hashed, it means it's about a vertical mile above sea level. This is arguably the worst topography on the planet for economic development. This is expensive to work in. It also means that all of the cities in northern Mexico are in desert, so they aren't surrounded by a belt of farms. I mean, look at the population structure north of the border, whether you're in Texas or in California, places where it rains. You have a dense population center, ringed by suburbs, and then a speckling of small towns. You don't have that in northern Mexico. You just have these sprawling cities and then a hard stop when you hit the desert. Now, there are pros and there are cons to this. First, the pro. Since it's an isolated population center, there's going to be one family or maybe 4 or 5 families that are in charge of it, that control everything. Finance, labor, electricity, all of it. So if you want to cut a deal with the Mexican to get into your supply chains, you know who you have to talk to because they control the town. It's very quick. It's very easy. It's a great partnership. I'll warn you that you will come back hungover and with a godchild because you're now part of the family, but it's a great business environment. Now the downside, when the labor is gobbled up in one of those northern towns, that's it, you're done. Mexicans don't have a tradition like we do of being physically mobile for work. So there's a limited supply. It's not all gobbled up yet, but we're probably past 80%. And so companies that have not yet started to reshore from China are going to have a really big problem because we got labor inflation here and they've got labor inflation there. The company that is most screwed is Apple. Every time something bad has happened between the United States and China, Trump trade war, more information about the genocide in Xinjiang, crackdown in Hong Kong, whatever it happens to be, every single warning flag that has been raised, Apple has not just ignored, they've doubled down on China. 92% of their parts now come from China, and they're going to lose them all. So I hope you like your iPhone. It's probably the last one you're going to have for a while. Okay, I love a good matrix. Okay, so the further down you are, the simpler your supply chain, the higher and the messier it is. You go to the far right, it's mostly in North America. You come to the far left, it's mostly in China. Let's just throw a few out there. Energy, it's produced here, it's processed here. The only problem we have with energy in this country is that our refineries are too good. We take the slop crude that nobody else can process and we turn it into high-end product. We don't produce slop crude. Other countries do, specifically Venezuela, which is gone, Canada, which has maxed out, and then other places elsewhere. So we tend to import the slop crude and export some of our high-end crude, and then we process whatever we can. So we're kind of internationalized, but we don't have to be. On the opposite side, smartphones. 30,000 facilities to make the modern smartphone. The most complex supply chains we have ever built. Heavy in China, scattered throughout the world, heavy in the East Asian Rim, and it's all going away. Here's everybody else. I'm going to highlight a few that are of more relevance to this area. So first off, automotive, 30,000 pieces. Whoa, good zoom tight. that was you, Vic? Wow. 30,000 pieces go into a modern car. And it's very common to have a Chevy that has spark plugs from Malaysia and a transmission system from Germany. I have a lot of problems with Donald Trump and a lot of things, but one of the things he absolutely got right was NAFTA 2. One of the many, many victories in the NAFTA 2 talks was the uplift in terms of the percentage of parts on any vehicle that was going to be sold in the United States to be built within the NAFTA trio. So the threshold now is 80% of the total has to be here. And things are coming back so fast, we're probably going to hit 85% before the end of the year. The network effects have been very, very impressive. So there are problems, of course, because if you miss one of those 30,000 pieces, you just have an ambitiously sized paperweight. But 85% is pretty good. Heavy vehicles, same basic theory, parts from everywhere. And the same clause of NAFTA applies to heavy vehicles that are used in mining and agriculture. However, whereas Ford and Hyundai and all the automakers decided to double down and abide by everything in NAFTA 2, the heavy vehicle makers did the opposite. They were just like, what are the tariff penalties? Yeah, it's cheaper just to pay that. So when this cracks, we don't have farm and construction equipment for a couple of years until it all can be restored. They're now realizing, kind of like Apple, that they made the wrong decision. They're rushing to find places to build it. Mexico and Texas are the most likely places, but anyone who plays in automotive can potentially participate. Aerospace. Airbus is a consortium of aerospace companies from Spain, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. I don't know if you guys have noticed, but the United Kingdom cannot quite figure out what Brexit means. They still haven't started official trade talks for what's next, which means that Airbus has become a political football. And I expect the breakdown of the company writ large, because Britain is where the engines and the wings come from. And I understand that that is necessary for a jet. China's C1 or C919, that's their passenger plane that they're trying to get into the market. It uses exclusively Airbus and Boeing engines. And so it will never fly because it's now under sanction. That just leaves Boeing. Good for you. Semiconductors, it's really not what people think. Where to start with this? We've all heard that semiconductors are mostly made in China now, that we only make 12% of the total. And that is true, but it's also a deliberate lie. We make 12% of the total by number. We make 60% of the total by value. If you're going to put something in a space shuttle or a server farm or your laptop or your phone, it's probably an American chip. If you want a blender that will sing to you when the margarita is at the right consistency, that's probably from China. So the whole Internet of Things, Chinese. The upper end, US, Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. Everything in the middle, and that includes aerospace, and that includes automotive, probably Thailand and Malaysia. So I am all for the Biden administration's program to bring more manufacturing into the United States on the high end. I think that's a great idea, including for semiconductors. But that's not where the shortage is. The shortage is in the mid-range. And we have not yet begun to address that. Now, we in a globalized system cannot economically viably produce the mid-range. We'd have to subsidize it. And the Mexicans can't help us with this, because Mexico does not have the culture of precision education that's necessary for the workforce. There's no good fix here. There's also another problem with the Russians. One of the materials that we're losing access is neon. Now, neon's not like any other industrial material. You don't need a lot of it, but you use it for lasers. It was a big Star Wars thing back in the day, not lightsaber Star Wars, Reagan Star Wars. And so the Russians built out the infrastructure because they thought Star Wars was going to be the future of great power competition. Now, of course, the Soviet Union collapsed before they could make that a reality, but they had already built out some of the raw materials processing. So you get neon in two phases. Step one, you have a steel foundry, and you have something called an air separation unit that pulls out the air and splits it into oxygen, nitrogen, and everything else. You're looking at your watch. Are we out of time? Sure. Okay. You then blow the oxygen and the nitrogen into the blast furnace to get the right temperature gradient that you're after in order to get the steel that you want. You then take that third canister with everything else. You take it to another facility, and they separate out the remaining gases. So carbon dioxide, argon, neon. 70% of global neon comes from the former Soviet world because of this. That first step, the steel foundries, those are all in southern Russia. They export via Novorossiysk, or they used to. The second phase is done in two facilities. One is in Odessa, and it hasn't had power for 100 days. And the other one is in Mariupol, and it's in ruins. 70% of the global total. What do we use neon for today? Etching semiconductors. Later this year, we get to figure out what we don't really need semiconductors for. Some things are going to have to go back to analog. Skip that one. Apparel! With two people with software and mechanical experience, you can now manage a 1-acre facility that can take cotton and turn it into yarn and turn it into cloth and cut it into clothes at a lower price point than 1,000 Bangladeshis. The entire apparel industry is coming back to the United States. The last one I expected to do it, but it's actually first in line after automotive. Okay, manufacturing is going to be fundamentally different because of the breaks in supply chains. We're going to have to inventory at every single step of the process. That is unavoidable, which means we have to have like 2 and 3 times as much product made at any given time just to keep normal supply runs running. Just in time is gone. It's now just in case. That costs money, that ties up capital, that ties up labor. And then we're going to end with a little talk on inflation writ large. This is the CPI in both the United States and Canada, very similar. Consumer price index, the primary inflation metric that the government uses. 3 phases. First off, the original industrialization and globalization wave. This is building roads and power systems and rail lines and skyscrapers. This is industrial-driven demand inflation. Baby boomers come of age. Houses, cars, kids. Consumer demand-driven inflation. This is what we're used to. This is what happens when the Soviet Union collapses and pours all of their raw commodities on the global market. This is what happens when 1 billion Chinese workers enter the system and pour a bottomless supply of cheap manufactured goods on the market. Everything that gave us inflation in the last 70 years is coming back, and everything that gave us low inflation in the last 40 years is turning inside out. Chinese labor's gone. Our labor is expensive, and it's already overtaxed, and we have to double the size of the industrial plant. And those millennials, they have faults, but they are now at the primo of their consumption experience. They're replicating the consumption boom that their parents did 40 years ago. The inflation we have today, this is as low as it's going to be for at least the next 5 years. There is nothing the government can do to fix it in any time frame less than that. There are lots of things they can do to make it worse. Okay, if you're looking for something to throw at someone, here are the books. Until future notice, all sales from all three titles in all formats are going to the Afya Foundation, which is a charity that is providing medical assistance to the Ukrainian refugee community. Right now, that is 9.5 million people outside of Ukraine and another 6.5 million people within Ukraine. So give them a donation, throw some cash their way, or buy a book, and I'll do it for you. And then this bad boy finally comes out next week. Yay! It was supposed to be out on May 3rd, but there was a paper shortage. Not a joke. But it will be here very soon. So the first three books deal with kind of the rise and fall of great nations genre. This one looks at the collapse of the globalization system and shows how the various economic sectors will collapse and then reform on the other side, whether it's manufacturing or agriculture or energy. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
If you have a question, just raise your hand. We'll get a mic to you. We have a couple of people, Craig. We have a couple of people who have asked questions online, and I'm going to I'll give this one to Craig.
I was wondering what she thought about Putin being taken out by his own people.
Oh, the idea of an internal coup? Not very likely. A couple things to keep in mind. Number one, most Russians are in agreement that this war is necessary. Now, they're going to disagree on some of the specifics, of course, but the propaganda is not too far off on what matters to them. This is an issue of national survival. And so if Putin were just to fall sick and die tomorrow, I don't think the policy would shift. I also don't think that a coup is very likely, because even if you did have a change in mindset, Putin has been very aggressive at pruning potential successors and not naming a successor. Because of the demographic collapse and because the Russian political system today is all former intelligence folks. They took over the Soviet Union at the end of the Soviet period. That's the whole Andropov, Chernenko, Gorbachev split. Putin's just the next one in that line. So the total pool of people who have like full training or have an intelligence background and were trained before the Soviet system collapsed in terms of its educational quality, you're talking 130 people. That's the entire elite. Here we have 3 million. So like one bad flu season, and this could be the end of Russia. But if there's one thing that the 130 agree on is that Putin has gotten rid of everyone who might be a threat. So there's really only one personality who might actually have the guts. His name is Igor Sechin. He controls Rosneft, which is the largest state oil company. And he used to be a gun runner during the Soviet period. So, you know, Iran-Contra, he was on the other side of that. He's the only one who might do it. But if there's something that the one thing that the other 129 agree on is that they all hate Igor Sechin. So if he did take out Putin, one of them would probably take him out within 24 hours, and we would be right back where we started.
The predictions sound very dire. What are the probability of all of these coming true? Do you have any good news?
Well, let me start with the punchline. The United States is actually going to profit from most of this. Our manufacturing system is the second largest in the world, and it's in a breakneck build out. We have labor problems, yes, but remember what those demographics look like for the Europeans, the Japanese, and the Chinese? Oh my God. It's like you're talking, the imbalances there are massive. So whether you're competing in agriculture or energy or manufacturing, there's really kind of only one shop in town. Now, this is disruptive, yes, but as a rule, the United States deals with cultural disruption and economic disruption much better than everyone else. I mean, we're still American. We're still going to bitch and moan about it. But on the backside of this 5 years from now, when we've built out that additional industrial plant, we're going to have supply chains that are shorter, simpler, closer to home, manned by Americans, Mexicans, and Canadians using domestic energy. So the degree of future shocks will be few and far between. And in that sort of environment, it's very difficult for me to see the United States being overly concerned with the rest of the world. Now, whether you think that's a plus or a minus, you got to admit it'll be a little bit calmer for a while, and that's probably not a bad thing. But getting from here to there, the road is not straight, and we have to get through at least 5 years of mid to high inflation before we get there.
Do you have any insights on Mexico solving their drug or crime problems anytime soon?
I do not think that Mexico is going to solve its drug or crime problems anytime soon because we really like our cocaine. If the United States stopped storing coke, we would be in a very different environment in Mexico. There are two cartels to pay attention to. The first is the Sinaloa. You guys remember El Chapo? That was his. It is in the process of falling apart. The one that is rising to take its place is called Jalisco New Generation. They are led by a former Mexican Special Forces dude. They are militarized. And while Sinaloa saw itself as a business, and so would not engage in petty crime or shoot random civilians, because that, why would you make work more difficult for us? The Jalisco New Generation sees violence against the population as part of their aura, and they believe in preemptively intimidating everyone into cooperation. Right now, the Sinaloa controls most of the plazas where the drugs flow into the United States. The Jalisco New Generation is challenging the Sinaloa and the other cartels at all of them. And if the Jalisco gets control of one, then the drug war spills north across the border. We're not there yet, but it could happen at any time.
I've got a question. And you've written about this and talked about this, the shifting in the voting groups, demographics, population. We see that the Hispanics are shifting more to the right, it looks like, in their voting patterns. What do you see for the midterms?
Oh, God, I hate that question.
In 2 minutes.
Okay, so right now, the political factions that make up the parties are moving around. And this happens every generation or two. Whenever you have big changes in demographics or technology or in geopolitics, we've had the retirement of the baby boomers, the peak consuming of the baby boomers, the height of globalization, deglobalization, now we have the Ukraine war. But to think that we would not change our political management system is a little silly. But while it's in flux, it's really loud and really angry and really annoying because every individual faction wants their issue to be the litmus test for the new coalition. And so factions that have usually only popped up like when one or two issues that are really angry for them come into the discussion, now everyone is doing that. We'll get through this. This is the 7th time we've done it, but it's always awkward and it's always painful. And we always, every time we say, we have never been this mean to each other before, but it's happened 6 times already. So I have no idea how the midterms are going to go. Americans are fickle and the parties are unmoored. The Republicans under Trump have ejected the business community from the Republican coalition, and it's not clear where they will land. But Trump managed to bring the organized labor movement out of the Democratic coalition. So right now, the Trump-style Republicans are wrestling with the Biden administration over who represents labor. We don't know how that will shake out, or at least I don't.
Thank you so much. What are your expectations for the cost of capital against this backdrop,
Sure.
especially in the US?
I would expect within the next 12 months, it'll go up by at least a factor of 4. Factor of 4 increase in the cost of capital. That doesn't mean interest rates will go up by a factor of 4. I'm just talking capital cost blanket. Every individual instrument will be different. So I remember when I was here last summer, I said, this is the cheapest capital will ever be in your lifetime. That was true. It's still true today. So that 5.4% mortgage that you can get right now, that's the lowest it's going to be for the rest of our lives. So the advice from last year still stands. Borrow for whatever you think you're going to need for the next 10 years right now. Doesn't really matter what mechanism you use. You will never get access to this cost of capital ever again, because very soon, whatever capital's left, in addition, because of the baby boomers, the pool is shrinking, that is what we will have to use to finance labor, which is in shortage, industrial commodities, which are in shortage, to build out the industrial plant, which we don't have enough of. We probably need to double it in the next 5 years. Capital is the limiting factor for all of that. So get it while you can.
I I'm not aware of a specific statement from the DoD indicating the U.S. intends to no longer maintain a worldwide presence, and the U.S. Navy seems to be expanding use of maritime drones that are force multipliers. What is the best indication that the U.S. tends to no longer provide security for maritime security?
Oh, well, during the Trump administration, the Secretary of the Navy came out on many times and just said, we're done with the Persian Gulf. We're actually withdrawing from Bahrain. So it hasn't been a secret. Drones are an interesting technology. We know it works for Air Force and Army operations. They're still testing them out for Navy operations. It's too soon to declare success, but I see no reason I see no reason why we won't have significant drone capabilities on most of the carriers within, let's call it 6 years. There's still a bunch of kinks to work out. Landing on a moving target is not something that software does well. But the smartest people in the U.S. military are working on it, so I'm cautiously optimistic. The biggest problem, from my point of view, is that where the density of cargo is, primarily that run from the Persian Gulf to East Asia, that's where we have the least coverage and the least forward positioned naval bases. So even if we wanted to patrol that zone, I'm not sure we could.
I think that you've mentioned the future of the European Union is not necessarily positive. Is there a way that they can come out of that, or what do you see happening?
If you had asked me on February 21st, the day before the war, I would have given you 1,000 reasons why it can't last for more than a few more years. And technically, those reasons are all still relevant. Demographic decline, capital collapse, a financial system that's a joke, the manufacturing system is too integrated, and yet they don't have the consumers local. All of that is still true. But one of the many surprises of the Ukraine war is that the Europeans are now more united than they have been since the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. I did not see that coming. And one of the first things this newly unified European Union did is have a conversation with the US Federal Reserve to make the euro subordinate to the US dollar. That is why the financial sanctions are working. I would have not anticipated that either. One of the things that a lot of countries are going to have to do in the next few years is decide what they want to try to make the relationship with the United States be. Because we've got the military capacity to protect them, and we have the consumption capacity to keep their economy going. And if they are willing to give us something in return, they can be part of the club. Australia has already cut that deal. Japan has already cut that deal. Singapore has already cut that deal. I would love it if the Europeans got one too. But it has to be their idea, and they have to offer something big. So Japan's a great example. Japan has tried to stay out of everything that the United States finds interesting because they just don't want to be on the wrong side of the United States. And then Trump went to them 3 years ago and said, if you want this alliance, you have to pay us 6 times what you are currently paying us for the privilege of us stationing forces in your country. They paid the whole amount and then they tipped us. Japan was the 3rd country to sign up for the Russia sanctions. They have decided where they need to be. Europe hasn't yet, but they've taken the biggest step in that direction that we have seen in the last 70 years. We'll see.
Peter, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Peter will be here for a second. If you want to come and ask him a question, you've got your books. Please take your book with you. Ask him to sign it. Take it home. Give it away if you've already read it. Give it to somebody that will enjoy it and get his next book. Thank you all very much.